Hello and welcome to video number 2 of this series of videos, which are basically a summary of my tutorials for the Introduction to American Cultural Studies, North American Cultural Studies to be precise, at TU Dresden in this winter term. I'm Kata and today we're going to talk about Fantasies of Terra, Nullius, Scenarios of Discovery. Let's have a look at our learning goals for today. The first one is, how is the moment of first contact constructed in different narratives? It goes without saying that this is, of course, the first contact between Europeans and the American continent, or also the population there. So, this moment of first contact and different narratives about it. So, we can gather from that learning goal, we do have different stories about that. Then we also want to analyze paintings which depict this first contact. So we don't only have stories or narratives as representations thereof, but also visual content. And then we want to explore the shifting image of Columbus in US American culture. Columbus is, of course, a very important figure in this moment of first contact because he was the person who more or less discovered America. More or less because, of course, it was only the discovery for the Europeans. Other people already knew that America or the American continent existed because they lived there. And also, Columbus, of course, was the captain of the ship, and there were other people with him, but he is basically the person to whom this whole narrative of discovery is tied in US American culture. And then we also want to look into how this myth of discovery, so basically this origin story of the European settlement in America that is quite mythologized, is still so relevant in US culture today. Mythology in cultural studies is a topic that I will not go into today, but if you're interested in that, just Google it and you will find sources about Roland Barthes and his idea about mythology and how this ties into everyday cultural narratives. Interesting, but not today. Let's have a look at the keywords we want to also go into. First, the doctrine of discovery, papal bulls, then terra nullius, and scenarios of discovery. We'll explain all that in the following minutes. Now, what is this moment of first contact and how is it constructed in different narratives? I first want to give you some kind of background knowledge about this urge to discover, which is the climate in Europe in or around 1500. We do have the entanglement between Europe and European powers and also other powers worldwide and different trading routes, for example, to Asia. Now, the Ottoman Empire in a way threatens that Silk Route because they basically have their empire in the middle of it and they're not really friendly to the Europeans. So coinciding with the advancement of maritime technology, and also papal bulls, we'll go in a second to what that is, but basically letters and doctrines that tell the people, okay, you can actually discover new routes by sea and also the possibilities to do so, results in the search for new routes by sea. And this is where people also discovered, well, what was not precisely Asia, even though they wanted to go to Asia. Now, what are all those, words? Paper bulls are first and foremost official documents from the Pope. Important here, Europe in the 15th century was very much religious and also very much Catholic because it was even before the British decided to break with the church and found their own church, the Anglican Church, and also before Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. So basically, more or less everything was Roman Catholic, and the Pope was a figure of authority. And if he sent an official document with his lead seal, the bulla, this is where the name comes from, then that was quite important. Now, what he did was he sent out a series of 4 of those letters, actually after Columbus' first voyage, but this is insofar not important as that the knowledge in those doctrines or letters was already there. So Columbus didn't really deviate from this knowledge when he discovered the Americas, but he also just took that ideology, and it was later that the Pope sent out those letters and then made it really a doctrine of discovery. You can read all that for yourself. What was important here is that this doctrine of discovery, this series of 4 letters, declared every land that was not inhabited by Christians as so-called terra nullius, another keyword here. It's basically vacant, so you can just discover it and claim it for another power, even though people might live there, but as long as those people are not Christian people, that doesn't matter. Now, this was the basis for colonial claims of, for example, England or Spain. Now, What happened was that in October 1492, Columbus was basically searching for outer Asia, and he made landfall in the Bahamas. This was land yet unknown to the Europeans, and well, according to the doctrine of discovery, yes, it didn't exist back then, but the idea of Terra Nullius already existed. Um, it was land that you could just claim, so he claimed it for Spain. He renamed the island, I mean, the native population called it Guanahani, and I'm sure I pronounced that wrongly. He named it San Salvador, and the indigenous population who were not Christian were basically taken as slaves or killed. Yes, not so nice. This is also one thing why this is still very relevant today, and why there are culture wars about this first contact. But Columbus then sent letters to the Spanish monarch and made subsequent voyages. And then, of course, after this doctrine of discovery was sent out, so basically, after the Pope sent out those letters, people traveled to the Americas and discovered new land. Discovered because, well, I mean, there were native people, but claimed it for other powers, and yeah, colonization took place in the Americas. Now, we have one cultural text, which is the letter that Columbus sent to the Spanish monarch. And now it's quite interesting to look at this first page about those letters. There were, in some, I think, four of those letters or three. Most of them are lost. Some are available as a transcription. One is still in the original. You can Google it, have a look into it if you're interested. Now, this is one of the letters or an excerpt from it, and if you look at it, you can see that, well, he describes what he did and how he discovered this new land. Um, but he also does have a very certain perspective in there, and you can question how authentic those descriptions are because, I mean, he does have a goal. He wants more funding to go and explore. And as you can see there, also, he claims that he reached the Indian Ocean, which is not true because it was just on the Atlantic. Um, and if you look at descriptions of the natives in that letter and also in the other letters, then you can also think about what role culture and cultural differences play. I will not really give answers about that now. It's just something you might want to think about and something that is an important cultural text in that whole discourse about the discovery of America by the Europeans. Now, one scholar who questioned the authenticity of those accounts or narratives was Diana Taylor. And Diana Taylor basically wrote about scenarios of discovery. According to her, this describes the falsified and also heavily constructed narratives about this first contact, which are, from a certain perspective, a European perspective, and claim authority and provide justification for this European colonization. Which is what is also important here is that you have contrasting cultural practices. So, of course, the Europeans had their writing, the Native Americans didn't have that. They, however, had their indigenous signifying practices. So, they had certain traditions and certain possibilities. We could name dances, but we could also name codices, which basically is not the writing the Europeans know, but something that has equal value to the native population. But this was not regarded as anything by the Europeans. They basically imposed their writing and then basically overrode the culture of the native population. And now Taylor says that all this is very much a part of the dominant narratives, but they are all just scenarios of discovery because it's staged, it's constructed, and it is definitely not what happened. And we have to be very critical with regard to those narratives because none of the narratives can be like the truth. It's all just from a certain perspective, and the majority of those narratives we have is heavily European and completely disregarding of the perspective of any native person. Now, if we want to summarize all that, what is important here is the background of this first contact, that we have the climate of discovery in Europe in the 15th century, that we have the paper bull's doctrine of discovery and the terra nullius idea, that Columbus did his voyage in 1494, thereupon discovering, in a way, America. And then we have this very important idea by Diana Taylor about these scenarios of discovery, which are basically the falsified and constructed accounts that claim European superiority and justify colonization. And this is something we can use as a very critical perspective to look into narratives, but also to analyze some paintings of the first contact. Now, a short note about analyzing visual cultural texts. Sorry. What is important is that you, at one hand, have those three steps in mind to describe what you can see, to ask how is it portrayed and how can you link it to theory, so analyze it, and then also to interpret, so draw a conclusion from this analysis. Of course, what we expect is not that you describe, then you repeat everything and analyze it, and then you repeat everything again and interpret it, but rather think connected. So basically, you take some element of the picture, then you describe what you can see, and then link it to theory and conclude from that directly. So you don't do this separately, but it's all interconnected. Now, I have two pictures for you, and I will not go into that now, but the task here would be discuss those questions, analyze the pictures with that in mind, and follow those steps of what can you see, how is it depicted, how can you link it to theory, and what conclusions can you draw from that. And what you can see here is that those pictures are, well, quite different. One is from 1892. It's interestingly not a very like up-to-date picture when you think of the discovery was in 1492. So this picture was way after. So it's also the idea of okay, how did people in the 19th century imagine this first contact? And then we have this picture from 2019, which is very recent. Important note here, Kent Morkman is an indigenous artist. So it's not a European person painting something about the first contact of Europeans and Americans, but rather a native person from the indigenous population of America today who depicts it very differently, I would say. You can think about those questions and pause the video for a moment. I want to go to the next topic now, which is Columbus in US culture. Well, Columbus is or was seen as an ethnic hero by some, apart from being the discoverer of the Americas for the Europeans. What is important here is that in the late 19th and early 20th century in the US, we had loads of immigrants coming. And also, especially from Europe, they were following the American dream, wanted a better life in the States, but the States were very much racist, xenophobic, and also nativist with regard to we are the white settlers in the US and this is our country, and all those immigrants coming in, well, they were not precisely welcomed. Now, if you look at that, some people, especially Jewish, Italian, and Irish immigrant minorities, claimed that Columbus, who was the one of the foundational figures in American mythology in the sense of who founded that nation, where do we come from? Of course, he's not one of the founding fathers, but he is basically the one who made the first contact between Europeans and America. And so he's a founding figure in a way. And now those minorities claim, well, but actually, he is a Homo Italicus. He was a person from Italy. But because indeed, Columbus was not, I mean, he did claim America for the Spanish or the Bahamas for the Spanish, but he is actually an Italian person. And so the Italians claimed, well, he is now our ethnic hero, and we see him as a founding figure for our minority here as well. And this also happened with regard to other minorities. So Columbus was claimed from being a national hero who discovered the Americas as an ethnic hero for certain minorities. And this is also where Columbus Day more or less developed. Background is here that in 1891, a prison in New Orleans was, well, some people who were not part of a minority went in there and killed 11 Italians. So basically, a very escalated conflict between settlers who were already there and then the minorities, in this case the Italians. And now President Harrison decided to celebrate Discovery Day in 1892 to appease the Italians and also to mark the 400th anniversary of this first contact. And this later developed into a nationwide celebration, a public holiday called Columbus Day, which is celebrated every year to mark this anniversary of the first contact. Now, the question is here, really? Because not all of the states actually do celebrate it. So there is quite a lot of diversity with regard to that. And not all people in the US are really happy with celebrating Columbus. Because yes, for some people who are white settlers there, settled there, made a new life, and now are happy being in America and live their life there, Columbus might be a hero. For some ethnic minorities who say he was a first Italian coming to the Americas and this is why the Italians can have their community here as well, may also be a hero. But what if you think from a post colonial perspective and you say, well, actually, Columbus did not behave rightful. He colonized the Americas, and his practices in the 15th century were actually not okay at all. And you try to reevaluate that. And we do have manifestations of different scenarios of discovery, of different narratives in popular culture, and also resistance to that dominant narrative of Columbus as a discovering hero. We have Monkman's paintings. If you go back to that slide and you think about, okay, are they really portrayed as heroes here? You might say, no. There's a graphic novel, you can just Google that. It's called Earth Divers Kill Columbus, and it adapts a native perspective where basically people say, what if Columbus had never discovered it? And basically, native people try to rewrite history. And you also have Carter Revaud's Report to the Nation, which basically turns that all around. So basically, many practices that challenge this dominant narrative and try to shed a different light on it. And you have vandalism. You might have come across that also in the British context if you are in this circle, because also there, some statues were vandalized, toppled, and this did also happen in the US, however, with a different aim. Um, what you can see here, is a statue of Christopher Columbus, and well, there was red paint spilled over it, and then you have this picture, this poster, "Stop Celebrating Genocide" in front of it. And this is basically one form of resisting this narrative of Columbus as a hero by saying, well, have a look from a post colonial perspective at what he actually did. Can we really celebrate that, or should we reevaluate it and maybe do something different? And this is where Indigenous Peoples Day or Indigenous People Day comes into play. This is also a public holiday that is celebrated by some, and Biden in 2021 proclaimed it, yeah, valid by the state, by the government. Trump doesn't do that. So we do have those different perspectives. And now we have several Americans who want to celebrate their Columbus Day because they say, well, Columbus is a hero for me as a white American or as an Italian American. Other people say, but Columbus is a colonizer and he basically robbed my people from life, from land, from everything, if you're talking from an indigenous perspective. And so you do have this fight about the meaning of Columbus, this fight about who is this person, what public image does he have, and how do we deal with all that today. And this is a very current culture war, also because, as I said, in 2021, Biden said, let's celebrate Indigenous People Day because this is very important. And then now Trump says, well, no, no, because he is very much in favor of a completely different narrative. And this is also what I would like you to do later in an application task. Here's just the summary. And I mean, I've talked about all that. You can read it for yourself. But this is the main important points. And this current perspective is also why it is very political to study that. It is a current political development, a current culture war. And if culture studies has a look into it, it takes a stance. It basically takes all these perspectives and says, yes, they are all valid. And now we want to disentangle them and look into what power structures, what power dynamics do we have, and also criticize that. So this is why culture studies can be political here. And now let's come to the application task. And I won't say so much about that, but you can look for yourself. You don't need to do a group work, that's from the tutorial slide, of course, but can have a look for yourself at those two pictures, which are basically related to Columbus Day. One is it's actually from this year, from 2025, a very Italian community in New York City celebrating the day. And you can look at what symbols are used, what flags are used, and how do the people look like. So what does Columbus Day mean for them? What can you take from the picture? And then you can also look at the other picture and, well, think differently and think, okay, what does it mean to people who might have done this? And how is this all relevant? Now, I will leave you with those thoughts and hope this was a thought-provoking video for you. But now, thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, you can drop me a message to my uni email account and I will try to answer that. And yeah, have a nice day.